Good evening, everyone. My name's Malcolm Hackett. As well as being a director of Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, I chair the board of the community company which owns and operates the 5 local Bendigo Bank community bank branches which have sponsored this webinar series. Welcome to the 4th Bushfire Resilience webinar of 2022. Why get kids involved in the family bushfire plan? This series of presentations has been organised by Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, an independent, community-led, not-for-profit association focused on improving community awareness and preparedness for the threat of bushfire. These webinars have been organised on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. BRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of the many lands from which you join us tonight and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. Please note that the webinars and the presenters are providing information, not advice. Our intention is to provide general information about risks to property and people. It's your responsibility to seek advice for your particular situation. This may be a sensitive topic for some people. Suggested services are shown on the screen. Thank you to our sponsors, our local Bendigo Bank community bank branches, the CFA, the FRRR, the Foundation for Rural Regional Renewal, Warrandyte Riverside Market, Nillumbik Shire Council, Safer Together, Rotary Diamond Creek, and Davy Pumps. If you live in Nillumbik Shire and the surrounds, then springtime brings on a round of fairs and festivals in Hurstbridge, Diamond Creek, Panton Hill, St Andrews and Eltham. Some are very, very big events and they attract participants from all over. Each event brings community members together and it strengthens the sense of local identity. Over the years, our community bank branches have provided significant financial support and staff support for these community events. We do it because they're important demonstrations of community spirit. We do it in support of the selfless volunteer groups who stage the fairs for the contribution they make to the local economy and for the joy they bring, particularly to young people. Last week's Wattle Festival brought people together for the first time in 2 years, and I expect the Diamond Creek Town Fair this Saturday will be packed as well. The Bendigo Bank community bank branches have a marquee at each fair, and we'd love to talk with you about your banking, your insurance, your investments. Bushfire Resilience Incorporated have a marquee too, and our fundraising raffle provides the opportunity to win a Davy firefighting pump worth $1,000. Summer is fast approaching, so call in and have a chat about your bushfire preparations and your ideas for future webinars. Thank you for registering your interest and for submitting your questions in advance. You'll be able to ask questions as we proceed using the Q&A function, but please keep your questions short and to the point. It will not be possible to answer all the submitted questions. We may be able to provide answers on the website. Now, these webinars are being recorded and everyone who has registered will be sent a link. Tonight's program includes 2 presentations, a panel session, a poll and a Q&A session, and we'll finish at 9 p.m. We begin with a presentation by Michelle Roberts from the Australian National University, and that'll be followed by a presentation by Briony, a co-director of LEADRRR. Then Michelle and Briony will be joined for the panel discussion by Rob Gordon, OAM, clinical psychologist, and Jane Hayward, AM, PSM. That means Public Service Medal, and it was awarded for Jane's work in bushfire education in schools. And Jane's the principal of the Strathewen Primary School. So welcome, Michelle. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's lovely to be here tonight, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation around how we can include children in our bushfire plans. If we could, thank you, Rowan, for starting my presentation for me. I appreciate that. So as was explained, I'm based at the Australian National University, and I'm the director of the Australian Child and Adolescent Trauma, Loss and Grief Network. Next slide, please. I too would like to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of our lands and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay our respect to elders past and present, and I'd like to add emerging. And I'm on the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung. Today I live in the Macedon Ranges. Next slide, please. So when we think about involving children in our bushfire plans, we often can think of lots of reasons why not to. And over the years in which I've worked in the disaster space, specifically working to support infants, children and young people in their experience of the disaster before, during and after, I've heard a lot of people say these things. They're too young for us to talk to them about this. They're too young to be exposed to these negatives of life. People worry that they might harm children's sense of safety, security, and do some harm to them psychologically by talking about potentially fearful things like bushfires, floods, and other disasters. We often talk about children being resilient, and we use that term as though they're unaware. And children can be resilient with the right supports. They're very, very rarely unaware. So to think that they're only little and can't really be of help, or that they don't actually know what's going on anyway, is really not a helpful thing to be doing. For a lot of adults, it makes them themselves quite anxious to think about bushfires and how they'd respond if there was a bushfire in their area, or to begin to think about their plan. They assume that because it makes them feel anxious, it'll also make their children feel anxious. We do know that children can take their measure of safety and what to be fearful from the adults that are around them, particularly the adults that they care for deeply. But a lot of people avoid talking about the bushfires, and they don't allow their children to have the opportunity to think and plan along with them. And I'll talk about that a little bit further on. A lot of people use the excuse that they don't live in a bushfire area and that it won't happen to them, therefore they don't need to be prepared. But increasingly we're seeing urban areas under threat, just as we do in the more rural and regional areas. And the final consideration I hear all the time is that it's too big a responsibility to ask children to be actively involved in the family's bushfire planning and preparedness. Next slide, please. So here's some things that we need to consider about this. Humans are hardwired to detect a threat to their safety. And babies, very, very tiny little babies, read faces, read facial expressions, interact with their environment, and can behave in a way that shows us that they actually understand that there's something out of the usual and is concerning. So we can't mask what's going on from little babies, and they will pick up on the change in behaviour, facial expressions, and feel anxious and frightened themselves. The notion that we can be protective of children by keeping secrets is misguided. If the littlest of babies can read your face, and there's a YouTube hyperlink on that slide, which is linking you into the still face experiment, which talks about and shows how children read facial expressions and look to engage with their carers. It's a lovely video clip that shows us just how attuned children can be to their parents' faces. So keeping secrets from children is really misguided. They will recognise that there's a dissonance between what you're saying and how you're behaving. And so not engaging children in the planning to be safe is a betrayal of trust. You know, we owe it to them to bring them along on the journey, to give them the skills and the knowledge that they need to be able to, one, keep themselves safe, and two, be part of the family's safety responses and planning. In fact, there's been research and articles that have identified that it's putting children at risk by not letting them participate in the family plan, and it can undermine their safety, not only their sense of safety, but their actual safety when a disaster strikes. The United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Children also very clearly say that children have a right to be part of the decision making in their own lives, and in particular, in my view, when there's threat to their well-being. We also have seen over the years of doing this work, and I think in our panel discussion later on in this session, you'll hear examples where children's parents have downplayed the situation or told lies about what's actually going on and the seriousness of the event. And what we found is that children alter their way of feeling safe and trusted with their parents, and they question whether or not their parents are the right people to be keeping them safe in that circumstance, because they've had lived experience of where there's been a significant threat to their well-being and parents have said it's okay. And I have an example of a recent conversation that I had where a child was told to get into the car really quickly, and he was very distressed about the tone in which his mother used with him in saying, get in the car now, because the mum could see the flames coming behind their house. The child didn't know that there was a fire nearby at that point, the mother believed, didn't understand why the mum was screaming at him. And his biggest concern was that mum's behaviour had changed so much and he really didn't understand what was going on. He could see there was a threat. If she'd actually said to him, this is what's happening, we need to move quickly, he would have managed much better than he did in the long run. What she said was, we've suddenly decided we're going camping, jump in the car now and we're going to a campsite. That boy knew that wasn't right. Next slide, please. So what we do know is that psychological and physical preparation are closely linked, and they're closely linked to how we perceive the threat and how we respond and recover from the experience. That involving children in your household's physical preparations for the bushfire emergency gives them a greater sense of control. And one of the factors that can lead to poor outcomes in mental health is that sense of being overwhelmed, everything being out of control, and not having agency and being able to keep yourself and others safe. It helps you to manage your fears, to have practiced calming actions, to have packed the things that you want to pack, to know what your actions are going to be, and know that you're contributing to the family's well-being. Telling the truth to children is really important, but it has to be matched to their developmental level, their ability to understand what the information is and what the expectations are of them. So something that you would say to a 3-year-old would be quite different to what you'd be telling your 12-year-old. Agency is a really important thing in disasters and in life generally. For individuals to have the capacity and resources to take action means that they feel that it wasn't overwhelming, out of control, they were able to contribute, they knew what the plan was, and even if the plan has to change quickly, they still have an understanding of having known what the expectations were around them and the practice that will allow them to make some changes if required. So that knowledge of what action should be and when to take that action is really important. There are tip sheets and advice sheets at the hyperlink down the bottom there on how to support your children, how to talk with them about disasters, and what to do to seek help should you experience a disaster. Next slide, please. I want to give a really brief example of a project that I was involved in with Lara Lakes Primary School, where we taught them to do CPR, and the kids then demonstrated their knowledge of CPR, trained their parents or their grandparents in the procedure, trained the people at the local bowls club and at the senior citizens. And when I asked the kids how they found the experience of participating in doing CPR, you can see on the slide some of their comments. They ironically thought that maybe their parents were smart enough for them to teach it to them, whereas the parents were wondering how their kids would cope with the learning. They made comments about not being as scared about what they would do if someone had a heart attack, and that they now knew how to assist and how to call for help. And one little boy spoke very clearly about he did actually worry because his parents were quite elderly, grandparents, sorry, and unwell. And he now felt that he had the agency, the knowledge, and had practiced. If something should happen that was adverse, he knew what he needed to do. The parents all identified that they were glad their kids had been taught this life skill, that they now knew how to care for others, and they knew exactly what steps they'd take as the event unfolded. Next slide, please. So what we're talking about is giving children an opportunity to learn by being part of the plan, that they have the knowledge and the understanding. They get an opportunity to learn the skills and to apply the skills by practice. These kids in the Lara Lakes example, all of them felt that they had more skills than their parents and grandparents thought they did, and they felt quite affirmed and had a greater sense of agency from participating in this project. It gave them a measure of psychological preparedness because it trained them not to be scared in the emergency, and that they felt, again, that they wanted adults to know they could do this. They felt proud of themselves for being able to do it, and they felt that they were given a level of respect by being able to teach others in the community the skills and knowledge that they had learned. And one little boy, Carlo, said that leaving kids ignorant might result in a death, and that wasn't fair to anyone.
Thanks, Michelle. That Lara Lakes example is a terrific one, I think, and I'll certainly be following up those links that you provided. Welcome, Briony. We'll hand over to you now, please.
Thanks, Malcolm. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming tonight. I'm on Wurrung country tonight, and I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders past and present. So for the last 15 years or so, I've been collaborating on research with children's schools, families, and fire agencies to develop evidence-based approaches to involving children in bushfire planning and preparedness at home, at school, and in the wider community. And tonight I'm going to start by talking about the benefits of involving children in household bushfire plans. And then I'm going to share some suggestions for how you can involve your children. But I want to preface all of this by saying that every child is different, every family is different, and every household bushfire plan is different. You know your child better than anybody, and you will always be the best judge of what they are capable of intellectually, emotionally, and physically. That said, I hope that what we've learned from the parents and the children who have been involved in our research over the last few years will give you some ideas for how you might approach things with your own children. Next slide, thanks, Rowan. So Michelle's provided some really good reasons for why children should be involved in things like household bushfire plans. Our research has provided kind of 4 key reasons that I see as being really important. So first of all, being involved in the household bushfire plan actually provides children with a strong sense of safety and security. So when children become aware that they're living in a bushfire-prone area, they do think about the possible impacts on their household and their community, and this can trigger varying degrees of worry and fear. But through the research, it's become really clear that one of the best ways to address that worry and fear is by involving them in the household bushfire plan. In my discussions with children, they will often say things like, I do worry about bushfires sometimes, but we have a bushfire plan for our family, so I don't worry about it too much. Secondly, involving children helps to ensure that their needs and priorities are accommodated in the plan. Children don't always articulate what's important to them, or they might assume that what's important to them is important to you as well. I once interviewed a 10-year-old boy in Huonville who was really worried about what would happen to his goats if there was a bushfire. When I asked him what his goats meant to him, he told me they were like his brothers, and his voice actually cracked a bit when he told me that. About a week later, I interviewed his father, who told me that their plan was to evacuate. I asked about the goats. He hadn't thought about the goats. Thirdly, children often identify problems or issues that adults overlook. So I once interviewed a mother in Anglesey whose son had been involved in the really great school program the local CFA brigade run down there for the grade 5-6 kids. Her son came home and he started asking questions about their household bushfire plan. So he asked what his grandparents who lived just down the road were planning to do. His mother realised that she hadn't synced their plans and that this was a huge oversight. So she got onto that straight away and had a conversation with them. Finally, involving children can increase household capacity for responding to a bushfire threat. As the children at Hayward Primary School say in their bushfire safety manifesto, if a bushfire is happening, kids need to know what they can do so they can stay calm and help their parents, instead of the parents doing everything and the kids just going, ah. When kids know what to do, there will be more hands on deck and everyone will be safer. We really need more research in this area, but based on what we know so far, when the kids know the plan, everything goes a lot more smoothly. Next slide, please, Warren. Please, Rowan. Okay, so how do we go about this? I like to start with a curious conversation. So before we start involving children in bushfire plans, it's really helpful to get a sense of where they're at. So we can start with this curious conversation. Even if you haven't discussed bushfires or bushfire plans with your child before, even if they haven't studied the topic of bushfire at school, they will very likely have answers to all of these questions. I've been asking children as young as 6 these questions for over 10 years, and their responses provide really important insight into their existing knowledge, their misconceptions, and their concerns. When I have these conversations with children, I don't correct them or give them new information. I just listen carefully and try to understand things from their perspective. The information that you get from this conversation is incredibly useful when you start talking to them about your plan. It will help you to tailor information to their needs, address their misconceptions, and also address any specific worries or fears they might have. Next slide, Rowan. Once you've had that curious conversation, you can start talking through your plan A. So the plan A I have here is leaving early. Your family's plan A might be different. It might be to stay and defend. Whatever it is, talk through your plan A first. We don't want to overload children with plan A, B, and C all at once. It gets confusing and overwhelming. So focus on plan A, give them some time to get their heads around that. And when they're ready, then you can talk about any backup plans you might have. So if your plan A is leaving early, you can talk through when you will leave, where you will go, what you will take, and what you will do before you leave. I also recommend explaining the why for each of these aspects, because when we don't explain the why, children often come up with their own explanations, which can be off the mark. For example, if you plan to leave on a catastrophic day, make sure they understand that this is a precaution. I once interviewed a family whose child would become very distressed when they would pack up and leave on days of elevated fire danger. And this made the whole process really stressful for everybody. It turned out that the child thought that they were leaving because there was a huge fire coming and it was going to destroy everything. Once she understood that it was just a precaution, she was much more relaxed. Next slide, thanks, Rowan. It's also really good to encourage your children to play an active role. So once you've talked through the plan, a great place to start is by getting them to pack a firebox with their sentimental items, favourite toys, photos, their pocket money, anything that they would hate to lose. This is a really meaningful activity for children, and they get a lot of comfort from knowing that if something did happen to the house, they would still have their most precious things. Bear in mind that children's special things are sometimes in daily use, so add those things to a list that is kept in the firebox, and they can quickly add those things in the event that you do need to leave. They can also pack a go bag with a few changes of clothes, toiletries, some bottled water, some non-perishable snacks. The snacks are really important. Whenever I ask children what they would take, snacks are at the top of the list. If you have older children, you can enlist their help in explaining the plan to younger siblings, kids are really good at explaining things in ways that other kids can understand. During the bushfire season, you can get the kids to monitor the daily fire danger ratings for you. The fire danger ratings are forecast 4 days in advance. They can help you plan ahead for days of elevated fire danger. Also during the fire season, remind them every now and again to update their firebox, especially after Christmas, because they might have a few new favourite things. And then if a fire does threaten, they can help with the final preparation, such as closing doors and windows, bringing things in from outside, organising pets, packing the car, giving the kids a role here will help you, but it will also give them something to focus on, which will help them stay calm. Next slide, please, Rowan. And then finally, children learn by doing. So when you feel they're ready, practice the plan. Review the plan in advance and with the children. And if they are taking an active role, make sure they have checklists of what they need to do so that they can work through those. When you're doing the practice, if things aren't going the way you would expect or are taking longer than you thought they would, don't stress. This is why you're practicing. Make sure the kids understand this too. You can discuss all the challenges and obstacles in your after action review and find better ways of doing things. The children will likely have really great ideas for how the plan can be improved, so be sure to involve them in that discussion. Next slide, Rowan. When you feel the children have a good handle on your plan A, then you can introduce your plan B. Reassure them that you'll be doing everything you can to make sure that your plan A is doable, but that it's always good to have a backup plan just in case. You can then talk through the steps for plan B and check their understanding. Again, encourage them to play an active role and practice. Next slide, Rowan. So the key points I've covered tonight are included in this ebook, which you can find online. Just Google "making a bushfire plan involve your kids" and it will come up first in your search results. The ebook raises some really important what if questions too, and they're really important to think about as part of your bushfire plan. Back to you, Malcolm.
Thanks, Briony. Again, really useful information, and it would certainly, I think, help people to focus on what they need to do and how to think about it. I want to ask our audience if I could encourage you to please complete our feedback survey. At the end of the webinar, we'll send you a link. Now, we're not just collecting the information for ourselves, the information, the response that you provide for other living with bushfire risks. So when they get onto our website, the collected responses, they can see the sorts of things that people are focusing on. So that's important. The other thing that we think is pretty important is that we need your help to let your friends and the community groups that you're involved with know about our webinars, know that there's a webinar recording there that they can watch, and that there are also videos and other information on our website. And you'll find a pretty comprehensive list of materials that we've gathered over the last few years, and it's growing. Now, Rowan, can I get you to show our poll question? So I invite you all to participate in this. How confident do you feel in your ability to successfully involve your child or children in your bushfire plan? You've only got one choice. Go for your lives. All right, thanks everyone. Now we'll have a look at the results of that a little bit later. And can I say it's terrific that there's a number of people there who don't have children who are watching. But if you can direct people, neighbours and friends and family who do have children to this webinar, that would be terrific as well. Now, I mentioned before, Jane has got extensive experience in education and that bushfire education space. Rob has worked with people over the many years working in that disaster area with psychological and issues. So it's fantastic that you're able to join us, and it's a very impressive panel we've got there. I'm sure lots of things will come up in our questions, but I guess that area of what's important for kids themselves. Jane, you've had a lot of experience in this. What have you identified in your work in school?
Good evening, everybody. As far as what's important to our kids, understanding and knowing where they live, I think we underestimate what it is that they're already aware of in this space. And I think as far as our kids here go, they want information and they want knowledge and they want to be part of planning and discussions, not just in relation to bushfire preparedness, but probably in relation to everything in their families and in their community.
Rob, are there any additions you'd like to make there?
Well, yeah, I think what Jane said is crucial, but I'd like to add to that. We have to remember that the key thing for children from which all of their resilience flows is attachment. And I think the feeling that they're involved with the parents in the thinking and planning, and that they can see exactly how parents are thinking about them and their role and where they fit in, I think enables them to feel that the family unit is able to respond to this event as a unit. It's very often the case in very dramatic events that people become terribly focused on their own particular situation, and the other people around them sort of feel as though they've been lost. Children can get lost. So I think bringing them into the plan helps, keep that all together.
I think both Michelle and Briony touched on this, that young people can make contributions that are significant. They're not. It's not just token. Jane, I know from experience in your school that students will go home and inform their parents' bushfire plan. They'll actually grow it by asking questions and so on.
We've really noticed over the years that we've run our bushfire program that trickle down factor, with what we're covering here at school, with what the children are curious about and investigate. They go home and they're doing the teaching on the home front. It's been amazing. I think we've underestimated for a long time just what the children have been capable of. And we're constantly surprised by how far they can go with their learning, and the questions and the problems that they're presenting us with to work through and explore. They're taking the knowledge home, and they're, even as far as, this year we did some work again, thankfully, after lockdown years, on the use of fire blankets and extinguishers. We did a household fire topic, and they all seemed to go home and were coming back with messages for Liesl and I about, well, we didn't have a fire blanket, so now we've, and the fire blanket was in the cupboard, but now we've got it mounted in a spot where we all know where it is and can access it, and it'll work. So children can drive change and planning and decision making.
Michelle talked earlier about anxiety and parents' anxiety about talking about these issues. What sort of feedback have you got? And I guess Briony's been talking with children too, that answers some of those questions about parent anxiety and fear of creating anxiety with children.
Is that for me again, Malcolm?
Or I guess you could start and
Do you want me to start with that
Yeah.
one? I think we were a bit apprehensive too initially about how far we could go and what we could cover without causing distress, because there's always that do no harm and cause no distress sort of blanket covering things. But, you know, the exact opposite was true. We saw, we had just an absolute example of a reduction in anxiety and distress in our children in fire season preparation and during the fire season, a reduction in that hypervigilance, I guess, when the days were a bit worrying and things. And that reassured families and parents and carers that we could manage the fire season, and that knowledge was important and planning was important, and understanding a bit of the science of fire and how things worked really mattered.
Briony, are there any things that you'd want to add there?
Just that, yeah, through the research that I've done with children, it's just really clear that once they do become aware of the potential for a bushfire to impact on their household or community, that they do experience worry and fear. But I always like to think of that as an adaptive fear, because, you know, there should be some worry and fear there. That's, you know, it's really important that if we're living in a high, you know, in a bushfire prone area, that the idea of a bushfire impacting on our community is going to make us worry, because then that spurs, can spur us on to take some proactive steps towards protecting ourselves. So I think of it as an adaptive fear. And yeah, I think one of the, it's almost like the children that have been involved in my research, their immediate response to becoming aware and experiencing those emotions is usually to think about, well, what can we do to be safe? What steps or what actions can we take? And the bushfire plan is right up there at the top of their list. So yeah, I think we can't underestimate how important, like what Jane was saying about, you know, the importance of them having access to knowledge and information. It really does have a positive impact. But I think that the important thing is that they're understanding how those preparedness measures or how those aspects of the plan will actually keep them and the family safe.
You did provide some tip sheets and some thoughts about how you could deal with this. I guess for a lot of parents, one of the worries is, will I do a good enough job? Will I do it the right way? Perhaps Michelle and Rob might want to comment on what's the best way to get your own head straight about how to have these talks.
Can I just jump in first and make a response to what's already been said? In my clinical work, it's really quite common for children to mask their own anxieties in the belief that they're protecting their parents, and they've picked up on their parents' worries and fears, don't want to aggravate that anymore, and so sublimate or push down how they're feeling. And the opportunity to face worries and fears together really empowers everyone, and the plan is part of that, but also the conversation in a accepting way within a family about what you can do when you do have worries and fears is a really important part of dealing with the anxiety of either the parent or the child or both. And parents, in having that conversation, are able to model ways in which we cope with challenges and try out different ideas to help each other work out how they can go forward with what they're worried about and how they can work around it. Rob?
Yeah, I was just going to add that if we go back to the really fundamental psychology of anxiety that applies across all ages. that it's a great rush of energy, basically. And if that energy, it's activated for enhancing our survival. If you can harness that energy to anything that gives you a sense of control, knowledge, behaviors, practices, reaching out, communication, all the things that will be put in the plan, then that energy activates survival behavior. If you can't activate it, then it spirals into emotion, and that's when the emotional disorganization occurs. And so just putting kids through this, talking, even mentally rehearsing, just getting them to picture what would happen, will reduce their anxiety. And I'd also say some children are very anxious anyway. The children are very different. And there may be a child who gets upset and cries, even at the talk. Well, I think it's so important that parents find that out and realize that they've got a very vulnerable child here, and actually start thinking about how to, you know, as Briony said, ask questions of this child, find out what they're thinking, help them understand, and then feed the advice and the planning into supporting that child.
I guess the other thing that came out of that those presentations was the importance of practice, or learning things by actually doing them. And we've talked in our other webinars about how important it is for the adults to do that too. Would anyone care to comment on how you can do that well? It's easy to say, well, you should practice, but are there ways that you should do it that are going to be more effective? You look like you're going to say something, Joan.
Yes, we will just here in a school setting. We of course have an emergency management plan, and we work through that with our children, from prep to 6, particularly though my senior kids, and we have regular drills, and we allow, with each drill that we do, whether it's a lockdown or an evacuation, we allow a question time at the end. And we've found over the last however many years that that's an essential part of our plan, that we can talk through the questions, the what ifs, the taking the thinking a bit further. And we allow that because that's how you get to know and be really familiar with a plan. The kids have come up with amazing questions and scenarios and things that we wouldn't have tackled. But I find with each drill that we do, and we do them regularly, of course, being where we are, the kids have really developed that, well, I called it the other day, muscle memory of understanding the plan. So we recently had a real lockdown that we had to enact, and it was actually just a dog that we didn't know that was looking a bit crazy out in the yard, and we had to do a lockdown to inside. So it was the first one that hadn't been a drill, and it was amazing. We were blown away by how well the kids handled the whole thing. And they just basically said, well, we knew what to do. We knew what it meant. The older children supported the younger ones, and it was seamless because they had learnt that plan. They understood it. They knew what was behind it. They'd talked through all sorts of related scenarios and just knew not to question. They acted, and then we talked. And I just think that knowing a plan and living a plan so that it's real is just so important.
I think something to remember about the creation of muscle memory is that it's very likely, if there is a fire and you have to enact the plan, that the sensory environment will be completely different from the way in which the plan was conceived. The sight, sound, smell, the feelings of suffocation, roaring noises that can prevent you from thinking clearly, disorientation because it's very dark in the middle of the day, and so on. So the only way you can reliably ensure that the plan will be carried out is exactly by what Jane is saying, muscle memory and rehearsal. And I think with children, there's a lot of opportunity to play games around the elements of the plan, or, you know, don't make it just drudgery, but see if you can, I don't know, have a bit of a competition about how quickly people can pack their bags or something, just so that it's not just, there are lots of different ways of enacting it anyway.
One of the things, oh yeah, sorry, go on, Brian.
I was just going to say, with children involved, one of the benefits of practicing is you can actually get a sense of how long it's going to take, because I think people often underestimate how long it actually takes to get everyone in the car and on the road, in, you know, when you've got to, especially if you're having to organize pets and younger children and the rest of that. So when doing that practice, to time it, just to get a sense of how long it will take. And then, you know, if you're really keen, turn that into a game and start trying to beat your time. I know that at Harkaway Primary School, every time they had to get on the bus for an excursion, they would time how long it took for everyone to get on the bus with, you know, for their, you know, practicing for their bushfire plan. And I remember during the Black Summer fires, I heard a father on the radio talking about how they got a warning at 3 o'clock in the morning to evacuate. And he said it was horrendous because it takes 25 minutes to get the kids in the car, even on a good day, when they're not stressed, when it's not dark, when they're not still half asleep. And yeah, so I think practicing it just means that, first of all, you've got a sense of how long it's actually going to take, but also, so that you can try to find where you might be able to save some time, because you may not have a lot of time to respond.
Malcolm, I want to jump in with an example. At ANU, we're in the process of developing a podcast for educators where they have an opportunity to hear from other educators about their disaster experiences and what they've learnt and what they want to share with their colleagues. And as part of that, we've had young people speaking about their experience of being involved in a disaster. And there was one lovely young woman who spoke about, in her family on a farm, every year there was getting ready for the fire season period of time, and they had their routines of cleaning up around the house, making sure their equipment was where it was, going back through what the plan was. And when they did actually have a fire at their doorstep, they swung into motion, and they'd been doing it for the last 10 years of her life, from the time she was a little dot and was out with the others doing things. And it was that muscle memory and it was the rehearsal, but she also was a bit older and was able to be much more adaptive when she needed to, when the circumstances were, as Rob said, with the sensory overload of the actual experience in real time. So the opportunity to do it time and time again makes such a significant difference, I think.
One of the things I'd be interested to hear a response to is there's two things here. When we talk about a plan as an adult, we may think of a really complex series of items and steps, and when we're talking about a family plan, how complex might it actually be for children to get the most from it? Can it be a synthesized plan? And allied with that is the idea that there's different sorts of fires. There's those big fires that you see on television, and then there's the fire that happens down the road, and you need to do certain things in case it comes up the hill towards you. How do you balance those ideas of different sorts of fires and different sorts of plans? Briony, you're nodding.
Because I was thinking that Jane will have really good responses to this, because they do a lot of bushfire behaviour work with the students at Strathewen, and so the students get a really good sense of how fire behaves in the landscape under certain conditions, under certain weather conditions. Jane?
Thank you, Briony. Well, we do a lot of work on understanding what days of risk look like and what contributes to it being a risky day. I guess living where we do, it would be bushfire rather. I mean, there are people who have grass fire would be the most likely issue in their area and things. But I think still having a plan for your home or family, it has to fit with where you are, what your risks look like, and be as detailed as that family needs. As Briony said, you know, that plan A would, I think, in most families, be to leave the area when risk looks difficult to manage, and fire control becomes a problem with those conditions. But there has to be that plan B, plan however many plans, because things we know, you can still be caught out and things can go wrong. But I think a plan needs to be written with your family and simple enough that everybody can understand and follow it. So it has to be stepped out and lived and understood and simple enough. You know, we did some work again this year, as I mentioned, on house fires, because also living where we do, nearly everyone here has wood fire in their homes, and you know, house fires in winter are a risk as well. So we talked about having a plan to manage the house fire, and what would your household do? What's the plan? What's the discussion been? And that had been, I think, overshadowed by bushfire season planning for quite some time. So that needs to be, you know, a consideration as well. But very much a plan needs to be as specific and as detailed as a family needs. It's got to be workable. It's got to be a living plan too, that changes with need, with the getting pets, with you know, having elderly people living in your home and so on. I think it certainly needs to change and adapt.
Malcolm, I've got a couple of thoughts about
Yes,
that. And the thoughts are stimulated by work I've been doing in the last year or so with people that were involved in the storms in the Dandenongs and up around Trentham and so on. This is, to my experience, a unique event. We've never had huge trees falling on people's houses before. But it makes me think there's no reason why that might not happen in the midst of a bushfire if the wind was strong enough. And therefore, I think it's very important for parents to consider the totally unexpected. We know the sort of flawed assumptions that people make, that the fire will always come from the north, and actually it burns past the house and then the wind changes and it actually comes from the south and that sort of thing. So I think building in things that don't appear very likely, but we know they happen. And then I'd be trying to suggest that people boil down to the absolute core things, stay together. And I'm thinking of parents who told me that huge trees fell on their house in the middle of the night, and their kids were trapped in their room in the bed, and it took 3 hours to extricate the kid from the bedroom or from their bed, in fact. So just to have advice about just if you're separated and things happen, just stay where you are and keep telling us where you are. If you can't move, just be confident we'll be looking for you. Just very simple rules like that, the sort of things you might say to a child about what to do with themselves if they get lost in a shopping centre or something. And then that way, even if something very unexpected, they can go back to some really fundamental principle, like I'll just stay where I am and I'll keep calling out just quietly, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. You know, the child might be going to the bathroom in the middle of the night, mightn't they? And then something happens. And what will we do if we can't get out the front door or the back door? You know, there are, I think, important things, so that you know, people disorganized when something happens that they're totally unprepared for, and just reducing that by these fundamental rules.
I guess those sorts of discussions for me always raise that idea of, well, how you're, whether you're trapped in your bed or whether you're separated from the rest of the family, how do you stay calm? How does the rest of the family stay calm? How can you practice? How can you practice those sorts of things? Any ideas on what people can do to talk about that with their children and what they can do for themselves in those situations?
Maybe building on what Rob was saying, you know, that simple self-talk, you know, short sentences, simple language to get your head around, almost little mantras was what Rob was talking about, with the kids having an opportunity to practice what they would say. And we can do that with self-soothing and calming activities as well. A lot of schools, and Jane, you probably do it, I'm sure, still, the social emotional literacy, the opportunity to talk about feelings and to talk about how you manage big feelings. There's some lovely books. I don't know if people know the Birdie's Tree books, really written for preschool age children, and it has that simple messaging, and every one of Birdie's adventures, whether it's storms, fires, floods, the big sick pandemic, talks about coping mechanisms that are age appropriate for the little people in the way that they can calm. And parents can read these books with their children and talk about what works for you. Does, you know, saying this to yourself help? Does calming your heartbeat down by taking some breaths? Some of those things that we do just when our heart's racing a bit, and we know some deep breathing, some calm breathing can be helpful. The Birdie's Tree books are available to be downloaded for free, or you can buy the hard copies like that, and they are amazing. And the work that Andrea Baldwin, who's done most of the writing of these, does with preschool age children in getting them to start to think about what might happen and how they might respond and what actions they can take and how they can seek help and what they can look to their parents for, starts that narrative and that storytelling, and then they can apply it to real life situations.
This is one other thing I think I'd like to add to that, what Michelle is saying, is that you know, we signal emotion with our expressions and tone of voice and so on. And there's a very great tendency, and I've heard it, for when things are worrying parents, they'll start speaking like this or yelling at each other. And when they don't hear, they'll start swearing and so on. All of this we need to understand is emotional communication. And I think once there's a lot of emotion around, we've got a choice of either containment, which is the sort of thing that Michelle is talking about, containment, keep bringing it down, controlling it, or contagion. And if you know, run around with your eyes out on sticks screaming at everybody, then everybody's going to escalate. Well, actually, sometimes the kids will say, calm down. If they've been to Jane's school, they'll probably be saying, you know, calm down. But I think just simple rules like keep your manners, speak calmly and quietly. You're not going to get it done any faster by screaming. You know, be nice and just be polite with each other. These things will keep the emotional tone under control.
Thanks, Rob. That's good advice, and we certainly had that in some of our previous webinars with just how you should calm yourself in any of those circumstances, and talking with one another. You can do an awful lot of damage as well by behaving in the way that you were describing there. Are there any things that because we'll go to the Q&A shortly, are there any things that anyone would want to raise that we haven't discussed?
Can I add in two things? Building again on what Rob was saying, we know that people with really, really high levels of arousal and fear often don't do as well in terms of being able to think and take planned action and the right action in the situation, but also it's often a risk indicator for worse outcomes for their own mental health after the event. And I see in the Q&A questions, there's a lovely one about teenagers often end up minding younger siblings in a disaster. Parents might be at work and they've got the responsibility for their younger siblings, or they might be told, look after the little kids, we're out doing this, fighting the fire. And the opportunity to practice and think about that in terms of your plan, that this might be the plan, you stay with the little kids and we go out, and then a chance to test that and to say, well, actually, I want to be out there helping, and, you know, why can't we have the little kids doing this? Or, you know, we worry about giving our children unreasonable burdens in disaster situations that will have adverse outcomes, but not having an opportunity to be prepared and to talk about it is an adverse outcome often in and of itself. So if you think your older kids are going to be at home looking after the younger ones in a tricky situation like a fire, you need to have those conversations, and they need to know what your expectations of action are and how you can help them to know what they need to do in that circumstance.
And I'd say, you know, coming back to the attachment, make sure you keep bringing into them, and for them to know you're not very far away, at least in terms of mobile phones or walkie-talkies or something of that sort, so they don't have to feel alone. They can be by themselves but not feel alone if they know that they're in your mind as an adult. That's the thing we need to convey to them.
Sourcing protective clothing for kids is a problem. Face masks, goggles, leather gloves, wool balaclavas, non-synthetic hats. Can the panel please give some guidance? Well, if you feel competent to give some guidance, Jane, have you had much experience with this?
No, we don't have protective clothing here for our kids. If we're in a shelter-in-place situation, it would be in our downstairs area. We've got a huge supply of woolen blankets. That was the best that we could do for if we find ourselves in a situation of needing to cover and protect our children. And we, well, as far as our plan goes, being outside would be a movement of students when safe to do so. And we plan on using blankets because a lot of face masks come with the plastic framing. A lot of hats and things are synthetic, and decking out 35, 37, 40 children is just not an option for us. So we will be blanketing it if we ever need to. So I'm not much of a help there, I'm afraid.
That's all right. And frankly, I don't expect anyone to be, because it's not your area of expertise. And that's, well, something that that we might need to look into and get up on our website. Regarding practice, can the panel comment on whether it's not enough just to practice, but has to be learning, not just doing? You talked about the afterwards, the review, about what was not good and so on. Any further thoughts on how it can be made, well, more real, I suppose, and become a learning experience?
I think it has to be understanding. So I think there has to be an understanding of what the circumstances could be for that plan to be enacted, and lots of discussion. The discussion, every time we do a drill here, we have different questions, and it is just so interesting. I think parents would be surprised with what gets covered, and that's been over years. And I think you have to work towards that understanding of all those why, when, how questions about the plan itself.
Yep.
In my PhD research, I found that the strongest predictor of the sophistication of children's knowledge and understanding was the extent to which they had a genuine role in the plan. So some children had been given token jobs to keep them busy. Some children had been given jobs that it was very important that they knew their job and how to do their job, when to do their job. And those children, their understanding of their family's bushfire plan and of bushfire risk in general was quite amazing. And you know, there are socio-cultural theories of child development which say that children's intellectual development progresses according to the goals of development in a household or a community. So in those households where those children had those jobs, and those, you know, it was very important that they were able to do those jobs effectively, and the children took those jobs very seriously. That had a huge impact on their learning. And I think that's come through really clearly in the work that Jane does with the student, you know, that Jane and Lisa do it with the students at Strathewen Primary School, because those children are being positioned as the bushfire educators of that community. And so they take that role very seriously, and they really step up to it, and they really, it really, it gives them a sense that their role matters and is important. And I think that is a huge part of the learning process.
Again, there's one other point I think I'd like to just add to that, those excellent points, and that is that I think if you look at what parents, particularly of young children, do naturally, is they have a kind of running commentary of what they're doing, particularly, you know, when you're, I don't know, you're bathing a child or dressing it or something. There's usually constant patter of conversation about what you're doing and why. And I think that's really important as you're actually performing your plan, and well, making it and performing that the parents are constantly describing and converting the actions into words. We're doing this because of this, and now we're going to do this because this is happening next, and so on. So you're weaving the whole thing together as a kind of narrative in their minds. Otherwise, we don't really know what they're thinking until you get to the other end of it.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think in my presentation, I did mention that children will, you know, come up with their own explanations for why we do things a certain way or why we do certain things. And, you know, I've interviewed, and children actually have a lot of ideas about how bushfires behave and how they impact on people and property. And I remember one child I interviewed from Wood End, her family's plan was to stay and defend. This was before Black Saturday, and her job was to fill up the bath. And when I asked her why she had to fill up the bath, she told me that it was because if the bushfire came from that direction, then the water in the bath would stop it. And so I guess that's an example of giving a child a job, but not using that as an opportunity for them to build, you know, further build their understanding of bushfire. So all these little jobs that we give, you know, that we can give to the children, it's all an opportunity for them to develop that understanding of bushfire more generally.
This is related, and it connects with what Michelle said earlier, but apparently there was a survey done in Maffra that showed 60% of the cases there, the teenagers were in charge of siblings while the parents were doing other things. And you mentioned before about token jobs. What sort of examples have you seen of where teenagers are in charge of younger siblings but doing really meaningful tasks, and what sort of things that are involved there?
Well, I can think of an example I came across on Black Saturday of a teenager, a young teenager, his job was to look after the younger siblings inside the house. And this teenager got very angry afterwards because they felt they'd been put at risk, angry with their parents. And I think what was, the parents in fact successfully protected their house. But I think the problem was the teenager didn't know what the parents were doing and knew that the parents didn't know what was going on inside the house. So you had this loss of the attachment. And of course, even teenagers will imagine what could be going on outside. So I think that you could even do it with electronic communication, but I think you're going to have kids looking after younger kids. The parents need to be constantly connecting with them. How's it all going? Is it okay? We're out here. We're doing all right. Be a while. Have you given them a drink? You know, and so on. So that again, you preserve that sense of attachment.
So I've had a young fellow who was very pleased with the actions he took in the Black Saturday fires with his younger siblings, where he was able to help them with the smoke, have damp face washes for them to cover their face. One of his siblings was asthmatic, so they had practiced how he would support his younger brother if he was having an asthma attack, and they applied those learnings to this situation. I'm thinking about my own son with Black Saturday, where he spent the night on the fire with his friend, talking to her on the phone as a point of connection while the fire was around her house and her parents were outside doing what they needed to do. And so he saw his role as keeping her calm and connected through all of that. And the parents were very appreciative of that, and so was the young person herself as well. So Rob's point about someone holds you in mind, someone's supporting you, someone's checking in with you, you're not there on your own and having to make big decisions all on your own. It's not uncommon for young adults to become the coping adults in the household when the parents start to feel panicked and distressed, and there's a bit of a swapping around of who's actually taking the parenting type role or the adult type role. And sometimes kids do feel aggrieved about that, or parents feel ashamed that that's happened, but mostly in the end people identify that was the action that needed to be taken at that point in time, and was.
I've also noticed that sometimes, because children have depending on their age, and teenagers often have a more restricted view of things, whereas the adults are spiraling out into all the possibilities and getting incredibly anxious and panicky about impending catastrophe, whereas the teenager or the child is just looking, there's flames outside the door, we should do something about it. And so I think that often they are an asset, because they'll point things out to parents, and I think the more we build that into the preparedness and give them the right to actually draw things to their parents' attention and so on, very valuable.
Here's a question here. I think I'll paraphrase a bit, but in the 1939 bushfires, Leonard Stratton said the best way of preventing and protecting was through the education of both adults and children. And we know that Jane's certainly been doing that at Strathewen. Jane, can you tell us what do you know about how is that moving in other schools and within the curriculum? Is it or is it just isolated examples?
Look, it's definitely there. It's included in the curriculum, as is disaster education and things. Look, I guess for us, we're in a position where our program developed out of need and evolved, and we're fortunate to have a really good and positive working relationship with our local brigade and volunteers and amazing experts and things. And we've made it a real focus and a priority, and integrate lots of other curriculum through our program. But I think for a lot of schools are doing bushfire education, and that's indicated by the number of schools that visit the Marysville Bushfire Education Centre or have visited over time. And hopefully there'll be further development in having centres like that that schools can access and visit and learn and develop connections with. I still think there are some gaps there with schools not, as Michelle said, many areas that were once not considered to be at bushfire risk now are. The way the urban fringe has sort of changed and things, I think we do need to be very mindful of risk in our areas. And it's just such a great learning opportunity. I do hope more schools get on board with. They don't have to do a program like ours. Ours is quite significant, but I think schools can develop something that's specific to their needs and where they are. I think there's a lot of learning to be done in this field, and our kids get out there, and we're trying to get them, now that we're a little bit more COVID free, to get out there doing some education and things as well, and developing resources to help with education in other school settings as well. So I think there's no end to the learning that can be happening to support community safety in this area, this whole space.
So Jane, it would be a good opportunity to talk about the Disaster Resilience Network through the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, so DRANSM, a group that is purely focused on curriculum and learning that can be imparted in schools and early childhood centres. And they have a wonderful website with a knowledge hub with lots of resources and lesson plans and activities. Briony and I are both on that group, and I think you are too, Jane, although I don't see you at a lot of the meetings because you're in class. But it's a wonderful resource, and I think it's an opportunity to continue to build the learning in our schools. And Jane is right, the curriculum has quite a lot of disaster resilience education in it, and more schools are interested in doing the preparedness as well as understanding how they can facilitate recovery when children and young people have been exposed to disasters.
Here's a question that I think, Jane, you'll want to answer this, but others may have ideas as well. This person says, could fire simulator software be useful for education, particularly of older children? Now, we've seen some in your school operating. Do you want to describe that?
We have, and with everything going well, we'll be back into that again next term too. We have, with our grade 5-6 students, we've used fire simulator software, and it was amazing. It was, I don't think it had been used with children before, and this was pre-COVID. We had the crew out here, and it was such an amazing learning opportunity for our little guys, and just looking at fire behaviour in a simulation of our local landscape, our valley and surrounding hills and mountains and things. And the learning, I think you'd agree, Malcolm, because there was the adult session in the evening. I think the learning was incredible with what we covered.
Jane, you should explain what the fire simulator is, because some people might not have seen that before.
Okay, so I hope, well, Lisa will be listening, so I hope I do this justice. So it was it's called the sim table, and it is done with, I think it was walnut husks, and we were able to create the proper, I guess, the topography and the lay of the land in our local area, and then set the weather conditions so that we could program in what sort of a day it would be, how many days since rain, what the wind conditions were looking like, temperature, fuel moisture, and all the rest of it, and then ignite simulated fires in the landscape to see how they would move, how spot fires happen, all of those sorts of things. And it was a great way for our children to see all of what they'd learnt about fire science come to life on a table simulating fire behaviour. Just amazing.
Yep, really impressive. And that opportunity to be able to change the variables so that people could say, what would happen if you did this? What would happen if the wind did that? So it's an area that I would hope is extended to lots of schools at some stage and lots of communities, because as you said, the adults got a lot out of it. Rowan, could we have a look at the poll that went up before? And we'll just get some comments on it. Who wants to have a crack? What do you think of the results there? So they're not confident at all is a 0. Somewhat confident, very confident. Is that what you would expect from the discussions you've had, Briony, with parents? And Michelle, from your research?
Yeah, well, it's really good to see that there are some in the upper end of the confidence scale there, because I think a lot of parents that I've interviewed through my research do feel really unsure about how to approach this. How much should they tell their children? How much should they involve their children? Will it make their children afraid unnecessarily? I've interviewed parents who hold the attitude that their children will always be in the care of an adult, so therefore the adult will be making the decisions, and so therefore they don't necessarily need to know about this stuff. But it's really interesting, because the more you talk to the parent, the more you talk to a parent like that and ask them questions and start to ask them questions about their daily lives during bushfire season, and they start to realize that actually there are times when their child is on their own, even if it's just for a short period, or they could be with someone who doesn't know how to respond safely to bushfire. So I think having those conversations I always think the conversations are the most important part.
Briony, that reminds me of the story you and I were talking about on the weekend, about in another state, a young boy's school bus dropped him off at home, near home, but the fire front was coming. So he was dropped off by the school bus with a impending fire there. And the problem that that young man had for quite some time after was that he knew that there was a hidden key and he could have got into the house and sheltered in place, but his parents had never trusted him enough to tell him where the key was hidden. So he felt aggrieved that he was exposed to such a greater risk because they didn't trust him with that knowledge. So I'm very pleased to see how many people have a degree of confidence of involving their children in their planning. Part of me wants to say that you're probably attending the webinar because you're those sorts of people that are very mindful of this and engaged. But it's exciting to see that there's such a good representation of people who have given it some thought, who are giving up their evening tonight to listen to the conversation so that they can learn more. And Malcolm, you've said a number of times throughout this webinar, share this with those people who aren't here. They might be the ones who really need to hear the messaging. So I double that and encourage you to have conversations in your workplace, in your community, with your friends about. I watched a webinar the other night and it made me think about how we can keep our kids involved in our plans. Do you do that too? And give them the opportunity to reflect on that themselves.
Malcolm, I think it's a really valuable thing that we've got a lot of people, a number of people who live in bushfire-prone areas but don't care for children, because you can hear so many stories of families with children who lob in to the house of adults who don't have children, because it could be anything. They could be passing, their house could have been ignited and they have to rush next door and so on. So I think it's so important that everybody understands, and I'm thinking of big research projects to be done in the United States around, particularly not so much fires, but I suppose they'll have to do plenty now, but around hurricanes and so on, which show that age is not a vulnerability factor in childhood. In other words, children are not more vulnerable because they're younger. They're going to be vulnerable for other reasons, because they don't understand what's happening. They're very imaginative. They've got other things on their mind, or, you know, so I think your story, Michelle, about the parents who didn't trust their child, I think it's really important to give children a role, even at a young age, unless you've got some very clear reason not to. And I know in my practice, you know, I've certainly seen 4-year-olds who I think had a better grasp of what was going on in their family crisis than the mother who brought them along. They were very clear, and they were, as Briony said, they were observing. So I think we should encourage adults to err on the side of trusting children and using them as colleagues and you know, comrades, rather than feeling you've got to do everything for them.
That's a great point to finish on. Thanks, Rob. We said we'd be finished by 9. We'll go a couple of minutes over. Thank you, Michelle, Briony, Rob and Jane, for a really thorough and challenging session. And I'm sure that your responses will get people thinking, and certainly having another look at their bushfire plan and working out how they can include their children in that. Now to our audience, remember, when you leave tonight's webinar, you'll automatically receive a short questionnaire, and your feedback is really important. It will help other people. I'd like to acknowledge Max Garner, Mark Gravel, Lisa O'Brien, Alan Bloom, Max Coleman, Fiona Mackin, Peter Milton Hall, Tammy Garrett, for their commitment in conducting this webinar series, and for maintaining the very informative website. And thanks also to Maggie Broom, Arthur Coates and John Bishop from the Ringwood Movie Makers for their invaluable assistance. And special thanks to the CFA District 14 HQ for their support in providing the webinar platform, and especially for the technical assistance and advice provided by Rowan Thornton. And it's great to have Rowan back on deck. Now, our next webinar will be Understand Your Bushfire Risk with Kevin Tolhurst AM, Justin Leonard, Ian Bennetts and Jeff Emerton at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday, the 21st of September. Thank you and good night.